Thank you, Mr. President. I must apologize for the late arrival. You can reduce my speaking time from 20 to 15 if you need to. Our country had the pleasure of having the Universal Periodic Review about a month ago and was gratified that many delegations of the Human Rights Council expressed interest to the promotion and protection of human rights in our country. Japan was then very delighted to have heard from more than 40 delegations of the Human Rights Council a number of questions and clarifications, as well as a variety of suggestions which our delegation realized very useful for their undertakings in the future. At the working group, several delegations very kindly expressed appreciation about our efforts on the human rights education, our efforts for the elimination of discrimination against leprosy-affected persons, and our assistance, including technical assistance, in all human rights fields. They all stressed their expectations for Japan's continued efforts in those fields. And Japan is willing and ready to undertake further such efforts to meet their expectations. Reappointed as a member of the Human Rights Council for the next 3 years, Japan will do its utmost in realizing its voluntary pledges and commitments it offered. As for the 26 recommendations which our delegation received during the working group, we submitted our comments to each of these recommendations in the paper already distributed, which reflects our efforts to accommodate positively as many recommendations as feasible. First, several delegations like Qatar, Algeria, Canada, and Mexico referred to the need to make efforts of establishing human rights institutions in our country. In March 2002, a bill was in fact submitted to the Parliament with a view to establishing a new Human Rights Commission, which was expected to function as an independent administrative commission and to create a new human rights redress system. The deliberation of the bill did not, however, complete because of the dissolution of the lower house in October 2003. The bill did not pass in the end. Now the Ministry of Justice continues its efforts to review the bill. A number of delegations, including Albania, the UK, Mexico, Brazil, Canada, and Portugal, recommended that Japan should consider ratifying various human rights treaties, including the first and second optional protocols to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, the Convention on the Rights of All Persons with Disabilities, and the Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Children Abduction. Japan has already ratified most of the major human rights instruments and fulfills the obligations set out in these instruments. In April this year, Japan presented to the United Nations its third report on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, its first report on the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict, and its first report on the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the sale of children, child prostitution and child pornography, and its sixth report on the Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. We have already signed the International Convention for the Protection of All Forms from enforced disappearance and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Japan will proceed to the examination of ratifying them as early as possible, and Japan will consider concluding the remaining recommended human rights treaties, except the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Regarding the standing invitation to special procedures of the Human Rights Council, we will consider it on the premise that the dates and the duration of their visits will be arranged at the working level. And at any rate, Japan has been and is willing to cooperate with them, and we are ready to know interests of each of them and arrange his or her visit to our country as time permits. The distinguished delegation of Canada recommended at the working group that the Japanese government should take measures to eliminate discrimination based upon sexual orientation and gender identity. For the purpose of eliminating all forms of discrimination, including discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, the human rights organs of the Ministry of Justice are now conducting awareness-raising activities for human rights counseling, and the investigation and resolution of human rights violation cases. The distinguished delegation of Italy made a recommendation that all forms of corporal punishment of children should expressly be prohibited, and that prohibitive and non-violent forms of discipline should be promoted. Japan accepts to follow up the recommendation to prohibit corporal punishment of children. And we are pleased to note that some of the recommended steps have already been put in practice. As for corporal punishment at schools, it is already explicitly prohibited in the Article 11 of the School Education Law in Japan, and the government of Japan has been promoting appropriate guidance to students at schools based on this law and will continue such efforts. The distinguished delegation of Bangladesh recommended that Japan should continue to provide financial assistance for countries in need of social economic development and to extend support for the global effort in the realization of the right to development as stipulated in the Millennium Development Goal 8. Our government accepts to follow up this recommendation.